What does it actually cost to own a white rhino on your own land? The wealthiest individuals on Earth don't keep petting zoos. They maintain private zoological estates, thousands of acres of curated wilderness behind a single owner's name on a deed. This practice has a name in ultra-high net worth circles: land maxing, the deliberate acquisition of neighboring properties to build a compound so large it becomes its own sovereign-feeling world. Before a single exotic animal sets foot on your land, the paperwork alone is a full-time job. Owning a white rhino or a snow leopard means federal compliance from day one, starting with the USDA. Private exotic animal ownership in the United States is primarily regulated by state laws, not the Animal Welfare Act. It sets minimum enclosure dimensions, mandates veterinary care standards, and defines exactly who is legally responsible when an animal is injured or injures someone else. A USDA Class C exhibitor license is required for exhibiting exotic animals to the public, not just for ownership. Inspectors arrive unannounced. Your enclosures, veterinary records, and feeding logs must meet federal standards every year without exception. Here's where the real numbers begin. A single southern white rhino requires a reinforced, multi-acre enclosure, a full-time keeper, and on-call exotic veterinary services. That runs into 6 figures annually per animal. Stack up the full operation: specialized staffing, round-the-clock veterinary infrastructure, USDA compliance, habitat construction, feed, and you're looking at over $1 million per year just to keep the lights on. A snow leopard adds another layer of complexity. As a critically protected species, acquiring one legally means working through accredited breeding programs, and the acquisition cost alone can exceed $200,000 before a single enclosure bolt is tightened. So why would any rational person spend $1 million a year on animals they can't sell, can't easily move, and can't legally exploit commercially? The answer isn't what you think. It starts with the tax code. Structure a private estate as a conservation or educational facility, meet the federal criteria, and significant portions of operating costs become tax deductible. The IRS treats qualifying zoological infrastructure as a legitimate charitable or educational enterprise. A conservation easement typically reduces the land's appraised value, but it does not lock it in permanently. The owner donates development rights to a qualifying land trust, and the IRS allows a deduction equal to the difference between the land's full market value and its restricted value. Meanwhile, the land itself appreciates. Luxury single-family home median prices rose 4.7% to $1.37 million in the first 5 months of 2026 alone, and raw estate land with conservation status often outpaces that benchmark. Here's the number that stops people cold. Luxury property searches in the United States doubled in the first 5 months of 2026 compared to the same period in 2025. That's not a sentiment spike. It's a documented strategic shift. High net worth buyers converting liquid wealth into hard real estate positions. Land maxing in action. Average luxury sales volume for single-family homes rose 4.7% year-over-year through mid-2026. But the real play isn't buying one property. It's buying 5, 6, 7 adjacent parcels and fusing them into a single private world. The most persistent misconception in personal finance that only the rich get richer while everyone else stays stuck. A 2019 Federal Reserve study found that households in the bottom wealth quintile held less than 1% of assets in tax-advantaged structures. Not because those structures were unavailable, but because most people never learned they existed. The mechanisms the ultra-wealthy use are documented in public law. IRC Section 170H governs conservation easement deductions. The Land Trust Alliance maintains a public directory of qualifying organizations. These aren't secrets. They're entry points any investor can locate in an afternoon. Consider Felix Prain, a former investment banker who retired at 40 and documented his approach in his book, Make Money, Be Happy. His core claim: most retail investors underperform, not from lack of capital, but from following consensus narratives rather than tracking where institutional money actually moves. Is a private zoological estate a genuine wealth-building instrument, or a status symbol dressed in tax paperwork? The documented record answers clearly. The Lewa Wildlife Conservancy in Kenya, privately founded, conservation designated, now a renowned wildlife sanctuary but not a UNESCO World Heritage Site, generated measurable land value appreciation alongside its tax-structured conservation mission. The financial architecture and the status signal are the same object. The IRS has sharply increased audits of syndicated conservation easements since listing them as a dirty dozen tax scam in 2017. The structure is legitimate when executed correctly, but the line between legal optimization and illegal shelter is thinner than most promotional materials admit. The legal version requires a qualified independent appraisal, a genuine restriction on future development, and a legitimate land trust with a conservation mission. Cut corners on any of those three legs, and the entire structure collapses under audit, along with the deduction. Back to the animals, because the operational reality is staggering. Specialized pharmaceuticals unavailable at standard clinics, portable surgical equipment, round-the-clock monitoring systems. These are baseline requirements for any facility holding large exotic species under USDA oversight. The staffing structure alone resembles a small corporation. A head keeper, a full-time exotic veterinarian on retainer, multiple animal care specialists, groundskeeping crews managing habitat, and a security operation to prevent both animal escapes and unauthorized access. The frontier is expanding beyond land. Billionaires are acquiring private islands to extend these zoological and conservation estates offshore, removing themselves from municipal zoning boards, neighbors, and public scrutiny in a single transaction. A private island introduces an entirely new jurisdictional layer. Depending on the country, the owner may be operating under foreign wildlife law, international treaty obligations under CITES, and domestic law simultaneously. 3 legal systems governing the same white rhino. CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, governs the movement of any protected animal across international borders. A white rhino transferred to a private island requires CITES permits from both the exporting and importing nation. No exceptions. Here's the actual insight. The animals aren't the investment. The land is. The animals justify the conservation designation. The conservation designation justifies the easement. And the easement crystallizes a tax deduction on an appreciating asset. The same structural logic scales down. A rural property owner who establishes a documented wildlife habitat corridor and donates a conservation easement to a qualifying land trust can access the same IRS provisions at a fraction of the billionaire's entry cost. The doubling of luxury property searches in 2026 isn't a coincidence or a mood. It reflects a coordinated strategic shift among high-net-worth individuals, converting liquid assets into hard, legally protected, tax-advantaged land positions, a pattern the Federal Reserve has documented across prior rate cycle transitions. In 2022, the IRS assessed over $1.8 billion in penalties against syndicated conservation easement transactions it deemed abusive, a single enforcement cycle. That figure shows both how large the stakes are and how precisely the structure must be executed. The tool is powerful. The margin for error is narrow. That white rhino grazing behind the iron gate, it's not a pet. It's a load-bearing element in a legal and financial architecture designed to protect and grow generational wealth. You don't need a rhino, but you do need to understand that every outrageous wealth flex has a structural logic underneath it, and that logic is written in public law, available to anyone willing to read the statute. One final layer. The Endangered Species Act focuses on protecting species from extinction and regulates the legal acquisition and trade of animals.
Species listed under Appendix 1 face the strictest restrictions. Acquisition requires documented proof that the transfer serves a conservation purpose, not merely private enjoyment.